The Battle of Crecy was the first major land battle in the Hundred Years' War. Now, by way of background, the Hundred Years' War, well, number one, it was actually longer than 100 years, but it had to do with the English claiming a right to the French throne. Now, spoiler alert, the Brits are going to win the Battle of Crecy, and they're going to kill a lot of Frenchmen in the process, but ultimately they're going to lose the war. They never captured the French throne. Now, this book tells the story of the battle. It describes the lead up to it. It describes the conduct of the battle itself. And the thing I found most interesting was how the author, Michael Livingston, figured out what he thinks actually happened in the battle. So let me talk about the book a little bit. The claim to the French throne actually goes back to 1066 to William the Conqueror. And, they had a bunch of little sparring matches along the way. Now, in 1336, Edward III assumed the throne of England. And he was a kid, he was 16 years old. 10 years later, he's in 1346, he is, he's a real stud. And he decides that he's going to go after the French and claim the land that he thinks England is entitled to, and ultimately claim the throne of France. Now, when he's doing this, he's got some disadvantages. Number one, he's got a big problem with Scotland. A problem on the northern border. They're constantly giving him a hard time, and he's got to keep that in mind. The second big problem he's got is that he's fundamentally broke. And he ends up borrowing huge amounts of money from some Italian bankers who had a great interest in the conduct of his campaign. And the third problem he's got is that England is one heck of a lot smaller than France. Now, what that translates into is that he can't muster anywhere near the number of men, soldiers, and whatnot that he would need for a successful invasion of France. In fact, when he goes to France, he lands with about, the numbers are kind of tough to come by, but probably something around 9,000 to 10,000 men. Now, when he decides to make the crossing to France, he ends up actually pretty close to what ultimately is going to turn out to be be Utah Beach on the Normandy landings for the Americans. And he ends up marching towards Paris and to the north. He's looking for some allies that are coming from what we now call Belgium and Holland. And he encounters the French at this little town, Crécy-en-Ponthieu, if I'm saying that right. Now, the French, their king is Philip, and a number I'm not sure of. I think it might be Philip IV. He's actually a pretty solid king for France. His big problem is that he's got his army down in the far southwest corner of France. And the English are already there. They've been there for a long time. And he's trying to get that land back for France. So when Edward III lands at Utah Beach, he's got to quickly pull together an army, which he does. He does it pretty successfully because France is so big. And what he does is he fights a strategy that's based on leading Edward on, teasing him with a battle, but forcing him to go through some miserable geography and ultimately trying to, as best he can, to avoid battle and to beat Edward simply by wearing him out, since Edward is so far removed from his source of supply and reinforcement and so on. So ultimately, he's not able to completely pull it off. In fact, I would say he comes within an ace of winning this whole campaign, except that he meets Edward III at this little town of Crecy. Now, what happens in the battle? Well, the popular accounts, the popular understanding of the battle is that Edward's use of English crossbowmen completely devastates the French. The French are using crossbowmen, and the crossbowmen are nowhere near as flexible or have the ability to rapid fire the way crossbowmen can. Now, the author of this book, Michael Livingston, agrees that the crossbow certainly gave the English a big advantage in the battle, a technological advantage, but he attributes Edward III's success to very clever use of the topography of the area around this town, and also he's got a much superior command and control system in place, much superior to King Philip's, to the French. Now, the upshot, without getting into the details of the battle, the upshot of the thing is that the French suffer probably 5 times as many casualties as the Brits do. And it could be that the number of Brits is something around 300. The number of Frenchmen is probably around 1,200 to 1,500. And the thing to keep in mind is that those numbers don't count ordinary enlisted guys. They're really counting knights and squires and other big shots in the army. So it's a huge, huge win for England. Edward III ends up marching to Calais, and they won the battle. Now, to me, the most interesting part of this whole book is how Michael Livingston went about figuring out what actually happened. And he started by walking the battlefield. And he discovered that the traditional site for the battle doesn't really square with the more or less contemporary primary sources for information about the battle. And he relocates the battle about 3.5 miles from the traditional site. And he's able to then pull together the primary sources, some of which apparently have been overlooked for years, and describe in detail how the battle proceeded. I found this very interesting, and the reason I found it interesting is he explains precisely how professional historians, go about assessing primary sources, how they go about finding them, how they can use archaeology, GPS, and other technological tools to really dope out what actually happened. Now, in his book, he really explodes a number of the myths that grew up around the battle, and I expect that didn't make him very many fans in UK, but I found it quite interesting. Now, by way of a footnote, I might point out that the 5 kings are Edward III, Philip, who I think is the 4th, the king of the Romans, the king of Majorca, guys I never heard of, and the king of Bohemia, King John of Bohemia. Interesting battle, very interesting campaign, and it really foreshadows the Battle of Agincourt, which is going to take place 70 years later, in 1415. I've got to say about this book, it never bogs you down. It's never boring. It's written in a very regular guy style. I think it would be the way I describe it. Anyway, really good book. Really recommend it. Interesting battle. Interesting, I think, for Americans, because I think we're a lot more into Agincourt because of Shakespeare and Henry V. But this battle is interesting, and Michael Livingston's book, I think, is terrific, absolutely terrific. That's all I've got for this week.